Winter's chill was freshly off the air after the Memorial Day weekend in Moose Lake, Minnesota, on May 26, 1999. Katie Poirier was working a late shift alone at the convenience store in DJ's Expressway Conoco service station. Only 19, the popular girl hoped one day to become a corrections officer. After midnight, a passerby called the police to report that the night clerk was not present at the store. Officers arrived and found the store empty. They checked the grainy videotape from the security monitor and saw Katie leave the store around 11:40 p.m. with a man. He was wearing jeans, a backwards baseball cap, and a New York Yankees jersey with the number 23 on the back, and his hand was at the back of her neck. From the way she touched her throat, it appeared he might have tied a cord around it to guide her. Clearly, the petite blonde had been forced to leave. Her family was notified, and officers formed a plan to search for the girl. Witnesses said they had seen a black pickup truck near the convenience store that evening, driven by a man that one person admitted had made her nervous. She gave a partial license plate number with 3 numbers and a letter. Police estimated the abductor's height to be about 5'10", and his weight around 170 pounds. He had longish, light-colored hair and looked to be around 25. A composite sketch was made from 4 witness statements, and this image was broadcast on local television stations and placed in area newspapers with a plea for information. While tips were being called in, hundreds of people arrived from around the state to assist in searching the wooded area around the Conoco station. The police used tracking dogs and helicopters but found nothing. Posters with Katie's image went into more newspapers and onto billboards around the region, turning it into a high-profile missing persons case. A local facility for sex offenders reported that all inmates were accounted for. Among the truck drivers that checked out was Albin Blom, who had registered a pickup with a license plate number matching the numbers offered by the witness, but the truck in his driveway was white. His wife, Amy, said they'd gotten rid of the truck with that plate sometime before. On June 6th, after searching a 5 to 10 mile radius, the official search concluded, but many volunteers continued, setting up a booth at the state fair to pass out flyers. They believed that someone somewhere had seen something that would make the right connection and bring the girl home. The perpetrator had been bold or stupid, taking a girl out of a store equipped with a surveillance camera, and investigators believed he had probably made other mistakes as well. It was also likely, since he was in this remote area at night, that he was a regular there, probably a sportsman. They were certain someone had seen this man either before or after the abduction. A search headquarters was established at the Hope Lutheran Church in Moose Lake, and staff there assisted in handling tips. Maps were placed on the wall with large X's, indicating the areas that searchers had covered. Boxes of maroon and gold ribbons, already handed out to hundreds of people, stood ready for new volunteers. But despite the efforts and hope of so many, Katie did not turn up. To keep public interest high, the police turned to a sports figure for help. 2 weeks had passed without success, and since the suspect appeared to be a sports fan, police asked Minnesota Twins legend Paul Molitor to make a public service announcement. His appeal to Minnesotans across the state got the attention of Darrell Brown, who worked at the Minnesota Veterans Home, who began thinking. On June 18th, he called the tip line to report his co-worker, Donald Hutchinson, who had recently stopped driving his black pickup and who resembled the composite sketch. He had been absent on the day following the abduction and had recently cut his hair. Shortly after that, he suddenly quit his job there as a janitor without giving notice. Hutchinson, investigation proved, was actually Donald Blom. Investigators now knew they had a good lead, since he'd been the driver of the truck matching the suspect license numbers. It turned out that he still had a black truck after all. His wife apparently had covered for him. He also owned a property 12 miles from the Moose Lake convenience store where Katie had been working. With more digging, investigators learned that Blom had convictions for sexual offenses, specifically for abducting young girls like Katie. In 5 incidents, he had abducted 7. Detectives worked quickly to get search warrants. The Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, or BCA, went looking for Blom, finding him with his family at a campground 140 miles from Richfield. In the early morning hours, agents roused him to ask some questions. He was arrested that afternoon, June 22nd, as he drove home from the trip and taken in for questioning. Blom had purchased the Moose Lake property about 2 years earlier, and neighbors said he'd spent a lot of time there prior to the abduction. But not since. In fact, uncharacteristically, the place had been neglected in recent weeks. Blom was not charged with Poirier's abduction immediately, but the sheriff told a reporter for the Star-Tribune that he was confident that we have the right man and expected to file charges shortly. When charges were filed, Blom was held in a county facility. He set to work making escape plans, which were discovered, so he was placed in solitary confinement. Blom's supervisor at the veterans' home reported that he had not known of Blom's criminal record, in part because Blom had used the name Hutchinson. He said that Blom had kept to himself, and few people knew him. This was apparently Blom's modus operandi. After each incident, he would change his identity and appearance and keep to himself. Word came out that while Blom had been friendly and cooperative upon being arrested, he refused to give a statement and had requested an attorney. In the meantime, the authorities organized a number of searches. Investigators searched Blom's residence and took various items, although no official statements were made at the time about what the items were or how they figured into the investigation. Another search was conducted on Blom's 20-acre Moose Lake property, and over 100 members of the National Guard and several hundred volunteers participated. They went several miles beyond his property into the woods, but by evening they had to call it quits. The next morning, the search was resumed with renewed vigor, and Katie's mother said that she had a gut feeling that they would find her daughter alive. Apparently, some hoped the girl was being held somewhere against her will, but the sheriff was less optimistic. That morning of the second day, among ashes inside a fire pit on Blom's property, searchers found fragments that appeared to be bone. These went to a lab for further testing. They were positively identified as bone fragments and possibly a tooth, which were sent to odontologists, experts in dental remains. Board-certified forensic dental expert Dr. Ann Norlander undertook the time-consuming and expensive examination of the tooth. At first, she did not think the item was even a tooth, but the more she looked, the more she thought it could be. She knew that under the conditions from which the tooth had been recovered, any DNA that might have been extracted from the tooth pulp would have been destroyed, so she had to resort to other methods. When she came across what appeared to be filling material, this confirmed it to be a human tooth and made it possible to determine if it might have been Katie's. Tooth fillings consist of an organic matrix and an inorganic filler material. The organic matrix burns off, leaving the filler particles behind. This allows an analyst to identify a brand or at least a brand group. Manufacturers use as many as 50 different filler types, any of which will show up brightly on a dental X-ray. Once identified as dental filling, the elemental composition and microstructure can be studied for its classification, based on a distinct chemical signature. While this is still class evidence, indicating one of a group, rather than uniquely identifying evidence, it does allow investigators to narrow down possibilities. Katie could at least be eliminated if it did not match her dental work. The composition of the filling of the tooth from Blom's fire pit matched that of the fillings used for Katie. In addition, researchers managed to identify it as tooth number 18 and determined that it was from a young female. The chance that it had once been in Katie's mouth rather than someone else from that area was quite high. While this type of analysis differs from the highly precise DNA probability estimates and thus cannot deliver statements with such impressive mathematical calculations, it provides another level of certainty that investigators did not have before the analysis. Since they had few other physical clues, a lot would hang on it. Blom's problem started early in life. In the 10th grade, he went to a reform school because he was a frequent truant and an underage drinker. In 1975, he kidnapped a 14-year-old girl, gagged her, and did things to her. He locked her in the trunk of his car, but she escaped and turned him in. He went to trial and was convicted. 3 years later, he committed aggravated assault, and 5 years after that was arrested for criminal sexual conduct. He also took 2 teenage girls to a remote area where he threatened both and sexually assaulted one at knife point. They were rescued only because a police officer saw their car parked the wrong way, scaring Blom off, but he was later caught for this one as well. Thus, Blom had 5 convictions for sex offenses that involved kidnap or sexual assault. For some reason, he had been left free to continue. In 1992, a psychologist conducted an extensive examination, learning from Blom that he'd been abused by his father when he was 13 and had been a heavy drinker ever since. The professional predicted that if Blom were not closely monitored, he would probably engage in additional antisocial behavior. Why he was out of prison after abducting 7 different girls was anyone's guess, and the scandal of his lenient treatment by the legal system would go right to the heart of the case. Had the system worked better, Katie would be alive. Instead, Blom had managed to change his name and shake off the taint of his criminal history, getting jobs, getting married, and his new identity as a cover to continue to harm. In the case of Katie Poirier, Blom was charged with kidnapping and the illegal possession of a firearm, a federal charge. Given his prior convictions, Blom was not allowed to carry any firearm. He was offered a plea agreement, but he still would not talk. But then in September, he said he wanted to make an admission. He worked out a deal where he would talk after he called members of his family. His attorney, Rodney Broden, tried to dissuade him from making any deal since Blom would probably still receive a sentence of life in prison. But Blom insisted he wanted to put the matter behind him. He was told he would receive incarceration in North Dakota, so he would be near family. While 3 defense attorneys sat in the room watching as Blom was given several chances to think it through and was fully advised of his rights, Blom went forward. He seemed clear-headed to all witnesses. On September 8th, Blom made a tearful confession which lasted 2.5 hours. He said that on May 26, 1999, he had gone fishing and then driven home to Richfield. However, later that evening, he returned to his Moose Lake property. On the way, he had stopped to purchase liquor and have a beer at the bar. He had seen Katie in the store doing some chores. He had not known her but had made a grab for her, and he said she ran outside. He followed and forced her into his pickup, then he drove her out to his mobile home. "I don't know if it was just out of guilt or something or whatever, feeling stupid," he said, "but then I choked her and killed her." He choked her from behind, saying it had taken about 20 minutes. He did not admit to any other type of assault. Once he knew she was dead, he placed her body in the fire pit in a fetal position and then gathered wood and paper to make it burn. Blom's account was somewhat inconsistent with the evidence, both from the videotape and the burn pit. He claimed he had walked out with her, with his hand on her arm or shoulder, but the videotape showed 2 people emerging from the back of the store, the man behind the girl with his hand on the back of her neck. Blom claimed he recalled her asking him several times to let her go, although she had not fought him until he was choking her on his property. He said he had managed to kill her with his bare hands. His account of the incineration of the remains was also problematic since wood and paper alone would have had difficulty reaching a sufficiently high temperature to reduce a human body to ash. He admitted when prodded that the whole thing made little sense to him. He did not know why he had done it. He confirmed with, "I guess so," that the remains in the fire pit were those of Katie Poirier, the girl he abducted. When pressed to say why he only guessed so, he said he didn't know the answer to this question. He was then asked, "Then whose remains are they?" He replied, "Well, I was asking that myself, man." When the interview was concluded, Blom called 2 local television stations to report what he had done and request that reporters now leave his family in peace. The deal also gave the seized property back to Amy Blom, including the Moose Lake acreage, the home in Richfield, and the family vehicle. Authorities did not yet say whether Blom was a suspect in other kidnappings or murders, and the plea deal did not include any further statements from Blom on this matter. For the Poirier family, the confession was devastating because they held out hope that Katie was still alive. Blom now averred that she was murdered and cremated, for no reason other than his late-night impulse. The maroon and gold ribbons, once given to searchers as inspiration, were now handed out in memorial for kidnap victims like Katie. But the family's sense of closure, such as it was to be short-lived. Blom soon recanted, claiming he made a false confession because of the stress of solitary confinement and the 10 medications he was taking. He said he'd been hallucinating and believed that his only way to escape the cell was to tell authorities what they wanted to hear. But he'd not been in his right mind, he now claimed, and did not know what he was saying. The plea deal was rescinded, and attorneys on both sides prepared for a trial. However, allegedly at his behest, The defense team already spoke to the press, reporting that Blom was guilty and that the remains from the fire pit were Katie's. There are different types of false confessions, and sometimes people just confess spontaneously to something they did not do. It's usually in response to a high-profile case where fame is a possibility, but it may also occur to protect someone or to expiate one's own sense of guilt for other things. Some people anticipate that the interrogation will be too stressful, so they give in quickly to the pressure to confess, but there's another type of phenomenon that can occur. People may internalize assertions of guilt from the police and come to believe that they committed a crime in which they had no part. False confessions commonly occur under certain conditions: sleep deprivation, feigned friendship, isolating the suspect by refusing a lawyer, using leading questions, excessive use of threats, exposure to graphic crime scene photos, and the suggestion that law enforcement already has evidence against the person. Also, if promises are made contingent on the person talking, he or she may do so just to relieve the stress. And at that moment, the consequences may not occur to them. The characteristics of those most likely to offer up a false confession include youth, a low IQ, mental illness, or confusion, a high degree of suggestibility, a trusting nature, low self-esteem, high anxiety, and poor memory. Some of these traits are exacerbated by the fatigue of lengthy interrogations, and anxiety may become confused with guilt. Whether Blom actually confessed falsely or recanted falsely would now be for a jury to decide. Blom was headed to trial. The trial began in June 2000, taking 5 weeks to select the jury. The trial took an additional 5 weeks with over 50 witnesses called to testify, including several key witnesses who would make all the difference. Assistant Carleton County Attorney Thomas Pertler opened the case. Among the early witnesses, Blom's brother testified that he gave the Blom family a box of old clothing, including a New York Yankees jersey. Blom earlier said he'd never had such a shirt. More damaging was the testimony from the 2 women whom Blom kidnapped in 1983, who agreed to testify about how he treated them. Jurors heard firsthand what he was capable of doing. He tied them to a tree, threatened them with a knife, and put socks in their mouths. He choked one several times, each time reviving her, and was preparing to complete his assault when a deputy happened to come by, causing Blom to flee into the woods. He was arrested 2 months later when one of the girls recognized him, despite him having dyed his hair, and he pleaded guilty. Both women, as girls, resembled Katie. Forensic odontologists then testified that the partial tooth was consistent with Katie's age, gender, and dental work. Dr. Ann Norlander admitted she was uncertain at first that the item was even a tooth. When she concluded it was, she had not initially thought it was Katie's, but then changed her mind. She admitted that odontological matching was more an art than a science, but maintained that greater information offered greater ability to make an identification. She testified that, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, the tooth was Katie's. It was the discovery of the chemicals in the filling material that led her to this conclusion. A videotape from another store's security camera, which had captured Blom back in May, showed that around the time of the abduction his hair, now gray, had had blonde tips, as affirmed by his barber, making him appear younger. The image identified as Blom by credit card receipts with timestamps resembled the image of Katie's abductor at the Conoco store, but for reasons not explained, these images were not placed side by side for the jury. Most incriminating was Blom's confession, which the judge allowed into evidence. Each juror was given a transcript to follow along. Afterward, the courtroom was silent, save for quiet sobs from Katie's relatives. The case against Blom at this point seemed fairly strong. Rodney Brodin, the lead defense attorney, called his first witness on August 7th. Amy Blom took the stand to testify that her husband had been at home on the night that Katie had disappeared. She smiled at Blom when she entered, and he smiled back. On the stand, she claimed she was able to recall where her husband had been that day because the following day she had seen a broadcast about the girl's disappearance. She gave it some attention because the location of her disappearance was not far from the vacation property they owned at Moose Lake, 110 miles from their home. Since Blom had a criminal record, she had figured he would be a suspect, so she considered precisely where he had been the evening before. He had come home at 9:30 p.m., and they had gone to bed. When she had woken up in the morning, the coffee had been ready, so it had seemed to her that he'd been there the entire night. She could not say for certain, but she had no recollection of him getting up and leaving. She also testified that the police had bullied her with threats that they would take her children away if she did not answer questions in the way they wanted. "They called me a liar," she said. She also denied that she had ever seen a baseball jersey in the clothing her brother-in-law had given them, and said she'd never seen her husband wear one. As she spoke, Blom shed a few tears, noticeably wiping his eyes. The lead defense attorney told jurors that while one witness had identified Blom in a lineup, 5 others had not. Then he had his own odontologist counter the testimony of the prosecution's experts regarding the tooth. As for Blom's confession, the attorney called it a stupid mistake. He claimed that another man had confessed as well, but had not been arrested. On August 10th, Blom took the stand in his own defense. Under oath, he denied he had kidnapped Katie Poirier and refused to let the prosecutor lead him into talking about the details again. He was on the witness stand for over 3 hours, alternately talking and crying. He claimed that his life had been falling apart and he had been feeling sick at the time he confessed. He added that his wife had threatened to commit suicide because of the pressure from the media, so he'd decided to do anything he could to be free of the cell in which he was imprisoned. He spent quite a bit of time trying to get the jury to feel sorry for him, as if he were the victim. He agreed he had made a confession, but said he had also recanted it. He had not been at Moose Lake on the night of the murder, he now claimed, but rather had been at home asleep with his wife, just as she had testified. Although he'd been fishing there earlier in the evening, he was home by 10 p.m., well before Katie had been taken from the store. Pertler cross-examined him about his reasons for making the lengthy and detailed confession. He led him through the details, but Blom gave only abbreviated yes or no responses. Finally, Blom told him he was getting upset with her queries. Pertler also asked him about his past criminal record and asked about the jersey. Blom claimed he had lied about it during his bogus confession and that people who claimed to have seen him wear it were mistaken. He now claimed he had never seen it before. In short, Blom was forced to admit to lies and inconsistencies in his statements to police early in the investigation, so taking the stand had done him little good. He came off to many as a whiner trying to wriggle out of punishment yet again. When the questioning was finished, Blom seemed frustrated. He turned to the judge, swore, and asked if he was allowed to make just one statement. He was told he was not. After closing statements, the case went to the jury. After 10 hours of deliberations, 3 of which were spent listening to the confession tapes again, the jury found Blom guilty. All in all, detectives had followed 3,500 leads and spent over $200,000 on the case before its successful conclusion. But Blom would continue to insist it was not over and predicted he would one day be exonerated. He again proclaimed his innocence to reporters as he drove to serve a mandatory life sentence without parole at a facility in Waynesburg, Pennsylvania. "I have never killed anyone," he insisted. He was certain he had a good case for an appeal, but he did not count on losing an apparent ally. Blom appealed his conviction on 6 grounds, including that his attorney had not worked hard enough to suppress his confession and that the court had not allowed him to present evidence that another man had committed the abduction and murder. He also believed the defense team had made statements to reporters that had corrupted the jury pool before the trial started. They had made statements, but supposedly at his behest. Apparently, his wife now feared he might win. No longer frightened of what he might do to her, Amy Blom now sent an email to 2 Minnesota legislators stating that Donald Blom had abused her for years and that she believed he had murdered Katie Poirier. She admitted that due to her state of mind at the time of his trial, she had been unable to tell the truth. She had falsely stated that he'd been at home with her that night, but now she was ready to recant that testimony. She was no longer married to him and no longer under his domination. Now she could tell the truth. He had not been home that night. Amy claimed she had endured Donald Blom punching and kicking her for 7 years. She felt guilty that she had allowed it, and ashamed, but had felt helpless to do anything else but endure living with him. She hoped one day to ask Katie's family for their forgiveness, but understood if they did not wish to hear from her. She believed that ultimately she could not have prevented what happened to Katie, as she had no control over her husband. He went to the lake property frequently to fish. He told her little, and she had not even known before the investigation that he'd been married twice before. He had taken her last name to try to conceal his past, but she had merely thought it flattering. "I now know," she said to a reporter, "that I was in many ways his hostage, paralyzed to speak up." Such feelings are common among women subjected to verbal and physical spousal abuse, especially if they have children and have few or no resources to help them leave. They feel trapped and demoralized. Blom's sons affirmed the violence, describing Amy's bruises and black eyes. She had attributed his foul moods to a bipolar disorder and had learned to behave in submissive ways that did not provoke him. She admitted that after the authorities discovered human bone fragments in the fire pit, she had asked Blom about them, and he'd turned on her with, "You're not stupid, are you?" To her, that had been an incriminating statement, but she had desperately wanted to believe that he was innocent. She now believed, she wrote, that her husband had committed other crimes, including murder. The authorities did too. Blom had led Katie easily from the store, as if he was used to doing it. They suspected he might be a serial killer. In 2004, an appeals court issued an 81-page ruling that upheld his conviction. While his trial had not been perfect, the justices determined it had been fair. They saw no reason to reverse the decision or grant a new trial. During the summer of 2006, Blom appeared ready to offer more. In a letter, he said, "It is time to talk." And Bloomington Police Sergeant Mark Stalick said Blom had supposedly been willing to answer questions about some local unsolved homicides. Apparently, Blom wanted to deal. He hoped that in exchange for information, he would be transferred to a prison closer to his relatives. Investigators agreed to the deal and arranged for the transfer. Then they went to see him in the hope of closing cases from as long ago as 30 years. Yet they also knew that Blom was a manipulative con artist. During his days as a criminal, he'd often changed his looks, name, and general presentation. As a registered sex offender, he'd been living under the name Donald Pintz, but that had changed when he married Amy. He was a suspect in the sexual assault and murder of a 19-year-old student, whose corpse had been left in the woods near where Blom had lived. In another murder in 1983, Blom had already admitted observing part of the assault, and he also said he might have killed a man whose body was never found. However, when detectives arrived with the transfer letter, the expected confession never materialized. Instead, Blom talked about other matters. He did this for 3 days, effectively killing the deal as well as dashing hopes for case resolutions. But he had advocates who maintained that he was innocent. On some websites, advocates claimed that he was railroaded and that his trial was a travesty of justice. It's often difficult to know in such cases when a killer is lying or telling the truth. Clearly, Blom has managed to convince people on both sides. At the end of December 2007, the Minnesota Supreme Court denied Blom's third petition for a new evidentiary hearing. He claimed that his confession had been coerced and that he had been improperly denied the opportunity to gather evidence demonstrating his innocence. He also complained about the fact that his imprisonment in another state hindered him from working on his appeal. However, the court decided that Blom's claims were procedurally barred, so he has effectively run out of options. Old, alone, and out of options, Donald Blom died on January 10, 2023 at the age of 73. He served 23 years of a life sentence for the first-degree murder and kidnapping of Poirier. Blom was ill and death was expected due to natural causes.